Putin wanted to strike back with his own kamikaze boats and rip control of the Black Sea away from Ukraine. This week, a single hit in Sevastopol stopped that plan at its most fragile point. And that point was not the boat itself. It was the building where the boats are born. Picture a speedboat that nobody steers, no human on board. Just half a ton of explosives in the nose and an engine that drives the whole thing at a warship at almost 80 kilometers an hour. Ukraine invented that weapon, and Russia is now building a copy of it in a workshop on the edge of Sevastopol, in the very same bay where Russia's proud fleet was humiliated for the first time 3 years ago. On the night of June 11th, that workshop burned. At least that is what the Ukrainian General Staff reports. And the moment the first accounts appeared, specialists everywhere asked the same question. Why now? Why the factory and not the boats out on the water? The answer leads to a secret that hollows out Russia's entire drone program from the inside, a secret that has nothing to do with the size of the explosion and that almost every headline that day missed completely. We will come back to it. To understand what was really lost that night, we have to step back for a moment and look at the whole map. The Black Sea is not an open ocean. It is more like one enormous bathtub with a single drain, the narrow strait at the Bosphorus. Whoever controls that tub controls the supply lines, the grain, the oil, half the economy of an entire region. And for 2 centuries that tub belonged to the Russian Navy. Sevastopol was its living room, its home port, the stone symbol of Russian power on the water. Then came a country that had almost no navy at all. At the start of the war, Ukraine had next to nothing you could seriously call a fleet. No destroyers, no big frigates that could go toe-to-toe with Russia. On paper, it was a fight between a heavyweight boxer and a man with no arms. So Ukraine did something that was on no classic battle plan. It did not build ships, it built bait with teeth. Take the hull of a fast sports boat. Pack a heavy explosive charge inside a camera at a satellite antenna. Then send the thing across the sea with no one aboard, steered by a person sitting hundreds of kilometers away in front of a screen like a video game, except that at the end, a real warship goes up in flames. No pilot on board, no risk to a single soldier. Just a floating bomb cheap enough to lose by the dozen. These boats carry names like Magura and Sea Baby. And they made the impossible possible. And they kept getting better. What began as a shaky experiment grew within a few years into a whole family of boats, faster, longer range, deadlier, with every new version. While Russia needs years to launch a single large warship, Ukraine rebuilt its drone boats in weeks, learned from every mission, and put the next better generation on the water. That speed is the real weapon. In October 2022, a swarm of these little boats drove straight into the harbor of Sevastopol for the first time. They slipped past the guard ships right into the living room of the Russian fleet and even went after the flagship. Imagine someone smashing the most expensive vase in your house with a remote-controlled toy car and getting away with it. That is how that night felt for Moscow. What happened next made military history. Ship by ship, the Russian Black Sea fleet pulled back from Crimea. Further and further east, all the way to Novorossiysk, more than 500 kilometers from the Ukrainian coast. One of the oldest fleets in the world backed into a corner not by battleships, but by boats that together cost less than a single cruise missile. Ukraine reopened the grain corridors that Russia had tried to choke shut. The living room was no longer a safe place, and this was about far more than military pride. Through the ports of the Black Sea flows the grain that feeds millions of people across Africa and the Middle East. When Russia blockaded those ports, bread prices rose around the world. It was these cheap, crewless boats that fought the sea lane back open and brought the freighters back. A handful of floating bombs diffused a global hunger weapon. Experts have been talking about a new era of naval warfare ever since, and they are right. The consequences cut deeper still. Big Russian warships barely went out anymore. If you are no longer safe at sea, you stay in port, and a ship in port is a ship that fights no war. An entire fleet, billions in steel and technology held in check by a few boats built in a simple workshop. For Moscow, this was not just a defeat on the map. It was a humiliation in front of the whole world. When you lose like that, only 2 roads are left. Either you build a better defense, or you copy the exact weapon that beat you. Russia chose the second road, and that is where the genuinely strange story begins. Because the copy carried a design flaw from birth that no one in Moscow could ever fix. What that flaw is, I will reveal in a moment. For now, just this much, it is not the hull. It is not the bomb. It is not the engine. It is something invisible, something you cannot spot in any photo. And that one invisible part decides whether an expensive boat becomes a real weapon or just scrap drifting in the water. Hold on to that. We will come back to it in a few minutes, and then the strike on Sevastopol suddenly makes a completely different kind of sense. Let's first look at what actually happened on that night of June 11th, because the strike on the boat workshop was only one part of a much larger operation, according to the Ukrainian General Staff. Over the day and night of June 11th, 2026. Ukrainian forces carried out a whole series of strikes against Russian military logistics industry and command structures. This was not a single pinprick. It was a coordinated pattern. At the center sat occupied Crimea. There in Sevastopol, Ukraine, struck by the official account, a facility linked to the production and outfitting of uncrewed surface vessels. In other words, exactly the place where Russia assembles its copied drone boats and prepares them for use in the Black Sea. Near the settlement of Ryhorivka, a storage site holding drones was hit as well, and that was only Crimea. In Russia's southern Krasnodar region, Ukraine struck the Afipsky oil refinery. This refinery is no small fish. It processes around 6.25 million tons of crude oil a year into diesel gasoline and fuel oil fuel that, among other things, keeps the Russian war machine running. By the available information, the facility was hit and a fire broke out on the grounds. And why a refinery at all? Because Russia's war is not paid for with tanks but with oil. Every liter of diesel that is not refined is a liter that does not roll to the front and a dollar that never lands in the war chest. The Economist reported that Ukrainian strikes on Russia's oil facilities have already cost the Kremlin billions in revenue. The boat workshop and the refinery follow the very same logic: don't hit the soldier, hit the source that feeds him. Let's pause here for a second because it matters for putting this in perspective. The hits on the refinery and the burning oil are easy to verify. Fire is visible. Smoke shows up on satellite images. The boat workshop in Sevastopol, on the other hand, we so far know about from only one source, the report of the Ukrainian General Staff. Independent satellite imagery or Russian confirmation of the exact scale of the damage does not exist at this point. I am saying this deliberately, because the real value of this strike does not depend on whether the building was 80 or 100% destroyed. It depends on what stood inside that building, and we are getting to that. The operation went further. The General Staff reported strikes on Russian command posts in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in places like Bakhmut, Selidov, and Pokrovsk. A separate hit targeted a drone control center near Novoandriivka, another a workshop for the building and repair of drones near Avdiivka. Do you see the pattern? That day, Ukraine was not hunting individual boats or individual drones. It was hunting the places where they are born, controlled, and repaired. And it is not doing this for the first time. According to the American defense outlet The War Zone, Ukraine had already struck a storage site for these exact Russian boats before preemptively to keep them from ever reaching the water. A few days earlier, on June 8th, the Ukrainian military also confirmed a fire in 2 oil tanks at the Grushovaya transshipment depot, likewise in the Krasnodar region. How far this pressure now reaches showed back in April. Back then, Ukrainian drones hit a Russian frigate in Novorossiysk. Of all places, that is in the very port the fleet had fled to in order to escape the drones. In other words, even the place of refuge is no longer a refuge. The safe backyard has long since become the firing line. Take all of these targets together and a picture emerges. Command posts, control centers, repair shops, storage sites, and right in the middle, the birthplace of the drone boats. This is not a list of random hits. This is a map of the enemy's nervous system, and Ukraine is stabbing deliberately at the nodes, not at the fingertips. That is the surface. An impressive list of targets, a cold, methodical night. But now, we come to the detail that almost nobody noticed. To the invisible part I spoke about earlier. It is time to solve the secret. An uncrewed boat is at heart made of 3 things: a hull that floats, a warhead that destroys, and an engine that carries both to the target. Any halfway capable engineer can copy those 3 parts. Russia copied them. Hull, bomb, engine, all there. In August 2025, that was even enough for a first success. A Russian drone boat sank the Ukrainian reconnaissance ship Simferopol in the Danube Delta, Russia's first confirmed hit with this weapon. But the cheering was short. Ukraine has hardly any large ships you could sink in the first place. And above all, Russia was still missing the one part that turns a single lucky hit into an entire campaign. Because there is a 4th part, and it is the only one that truly matters: the connection. A drone boat is only as good as the invisible leash that ties it to its pilot. Snap that leash, and the wonder weapon becomes a blind death box bobbing pointlessly in the water. Picture a remote-controlled car whose remote is dead. Full tank, 4 perfect tires, a strong engine, and it still does not move a single meter because no one can tell it where to go. That is exactly Russia's problem, and it is a far bigger problem than Moscow would admit. And now it matters why this particular part is so hard. A drone boat does not travel 200 meters, but often hundreds of kilometers far over the horizon. An ordinary radio link is not enough out there. The Earth is round. At some point, the boat vanishes behind the curve of the horizon and the signal is gone. To steer it anyway and see live through its camera, you need satellites, and not 1 or 2, but a whole net of thousands that blanket the sky without gaps. That is exactly what Starlink is. You do not improvise a net like that overnight. Russia can copy a great many things. A fleet of its own thousands of satellites in orbit is not one of them. An advisor to Ukraine's defense ministry on technical matters, Serhiy Bezkresnov, said it out loud this spring. Russia never managed to equip its drone boats with a working communication system of its own. Russian engineers tried a whole series of systems. One after another they failed. Either they did not work at all or they were too unreliable to send seriously into war. In the end, only a single technology was left that worked reliably off the Ukrainian coast: Starlink. The satellite terminals from Elon Musk's company, the very same technology Ukraine uses to steer its own boats, and this is exactly where Ukraine pulled the plug. At Kyiv's request, SpaceX blocked Russian access to Starlink earlier this year. Overnight, Russia's drone boats lost their only working nervous system. According to Bezkresnov, 2026 was supposed to be the year Russia deployed these boats at scale. Instead, the entire plan collapsed before it had really begun. Let that thought sink in for a moment. Russia built the boats. They are standing there, finished, armed, fueled, in theory, ready to go, and they are as good as useless because the invisible leash is missing. And even if that leash one day holds the Black Sea, today is the most heavily jammed stretch of sea in the world. Both sides flood the airwaves with electronic noise that swallows signals and renders drones blind and deaf. Ukraine has been fighting this invisible war for years and holds an enormous head start. It knows how to jam, and it knows how to get through despite jamming. Russia is only at the start of a learning curve that Ukraine has long since climbed. Whoever sets off earlier is simply further along. There is a clue to how deep this problem runs. The only Russian drone boat that has shown any usable missions at all, a model called Sirius, did not appear on the open sea, but on a river on the Dnipro, where it laid mines. On a river, the bank is close, the horizon is no obstacle. The connection is simple. Exactly where Russia's boats work, they are least dangerous. And exactly where they would be dangerous far out against Ukraine's fleet, they do not work. That is no coincidence. That is the direct consequence of the missing nervous system. And that is what changes everything about the strike on Sevastopol. Because now you understand why Ukraine did not go hunting individual boats out on the sea. Hitting individual boats on the open water is expensive, slow, and dangerous. It is like trying to shoot a swarm of mosquitoes out of the air one by one. It is far smarter to smoke out the nest while all the mosquitoes are still sitting inside it. And that is exactly what this workshop in Sevastopol was. The nest. The one place where Russia's finished but paralyzed boats came together, packed tightly on land, bundled with no way to scatter quickly. Bezkresnov himself warned that you must not underestimate the enemy. The Russians, he said, are highly motivated to finally deploy their boats precisely because they are already built. Already built. They are only waiting for a fix to the connection problem. And while they wait, they sit crammed together in a single spot. That is the most fragile point the whole thing started with, not the boat. The moment when all the boats wait together on land before they have ever seen the water. Militaries have a name for this idea. They call it hitting the enemy left of launch, that is not intercepting the weapon after it fires, but destroying it before it ever gets going. Stopping a missile in flight is the most expensive and least certain way to solve a problem. Destroying that same missile in the factory is the cheapest and surest. Ukraine struck at exactly this point in the chain right at the beginning, where a single hit does the most before the threat splits into dozens of individual boats you would then have to chase across the whole sea. Do the math for a second. A single Ukrainian Magura boat costs roughly $250,000. A Russian warship costs hundreds of millions. Russia has announced it will pour around $100 billion into modernizing its navy, and has even created its own force for uncrewed systems with the goal of training 1 million specialists by 2030. That is a huge publicly declared bet on the future. A hit on the birthplace of these boats is therefore more than a military strike. It is a strike against a promise, and it is not only about building. The British Defense Ministry noted back in January that Russia is at the same time trying to build a defense against the Ukrainian boats and is falling behind there too. That is the bitter position for Moscow, too slow on offense, too late on defense. In this war, what decides is not who has the larger fleet. What decides is who learns faster. And so far, Ukraine learns a little faster in every round. And that is the whole difference between a headline and what actually counts. The headline says, "A factory burned." The truth underneath says Russia built a drone program that is missing the one thing it needs to work, and Ukraine hit that program on the exact day it was most vulnerable. But the story is not over yet, because the more interesting question is not what just happened, it is what comes next. So let's look ahead. What does Russia do now? At the core, there are three roads, and they lead to very different futures. The first road, Russia solves the connection problem. There are already signs that Russian engineers are working on a satellite antenna of their own. Russian media showed a new model under a protective dome. If that succeeds, the boats come back and the threat in the Black Sea starts over. But be careful, an antenna on a press photo is a long way from an antenna that actually holds up in salt water under fire and against Ukrainian jamming. Between a prototype and a battle-ready weapon often lie years. The second road, Russia disperses production. Instead of one large workshop that burns with a single hit, many small hidden workshops. Harder to find, harder to bomb, but also slower and more expensive to produce. The third road. Russia gives up the open sea and limits its boats to rivers and to mine laying where the range is short and the connection less critical. The Russian Sirius model has already done exactly that and laid mines in the Dnipro, a limited, far less dangerous consolation prize. And here is my bet. I think a mix of the second road and a very slow first road is the most likely. Russia will scatter production and at the same time grind doggedly away at the connection problem. The program will survive, but crippled, delayed, and expensive. The reason is simple. Moscow has publicly bet far too much on these boats to give up now. But the connection problem is not some small defect you fix overnight. It is the one hard nut Russian engineers have been failing to crack for over a year. And their most convenient way out, Starlink, has slammed shut for good. And time is everything here. Every month, Russia loses. Searching for a connection is a month in which Ukraine develops its own boats, further hits new targets, and widens its lead. Russia is chasing a moving train, and the train is speeding up. And the consequences reach beyond the Black Sea. As long as Russia's boats are stuck on land, the fleet stays in port. The grain corridors stay open. The most expensive navy in the region stays held in check by a few workshops. Every day Russia's answer does not reach the water is a day Ukraine commands the sea without owning a real fleet. That is the quiet, larger story behind the fire in Sevastopol. Now, the most important part, the condition under which I am wrong. Because a prediction without an emergency exit is just an assertion. I am wrong if in the coming months we see Russian drone boats striking reliably off the Ukrainian coast and doing it with a working satellite system of their own, not with Starlink. If footage suddenly appears in which a Russian boat hits a Ukrainian target steered through that new antenna under the protective dome, then the hard nut is cracked. Then this strike on Sevastopol was only a delay and not a turning point. Keep this one image in the back of your mind, a Russian antenna, not an American one. That is the litmus test. And with that, we are at the end and at the same time at the real beginning. Because if I am right, the next decisive sign in this war on the water will not be a Russian boat putting out to sea. It will be a photo. The photo of an antenna. Watch the dome. If it shows up in real use and works, then Russia is back in the game. If it stays only a prototype on a press image, then that burning workshop in Sevastopol was the moment Moscow's answer to the Ukrainian killer boats died before it ever really reached the water. A country with no navy took the Black Sea away from one of the oldest fleets in the world. And when that fleet copied the very weapon that beat it, the copy burned in its own cradle. What does that tell us about the wars being rewritten in front of our eyes right now? If you want to understand how these wars actually work beneath the surface, past the headlines, then subscribe so you never miss the next breakdown. And share this with one person who still believes the war at sea is about big ships, because it isn't. Not anymore.